Federal prosecutors just got another win in their case against P. Diddy when a male escort reportedly handed over a sex tape showing one of Diddy's alleged freak-offs. It's these freak-offs that are at the center of the federal indictment against Diddy, and now prosecutors have even more digital evidence against him. But what does this alleged sex tape mean for the prosecution? Could even more tapes come out as we await trial? We'll hear from former federal prosecutor Nima Rahmani about this and so much more. I'm Gillespie, and this is Law&Crime News. P. Diddy, Puffy, Puff Daddy, there are a number of monikers you could call 54-year-old Sean Combs, the once beloved music icon and entrepreneur. But more recently, he's been known as an alleged sexual predator after a series of civil suits, federal raids, and ultimately his arrest. Diddy was indicted by a grand jury on September 16th on charges of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution. In the indictment, prosecutors allege Diddy is guilty of sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The indictment goes on to allege Diddy showed a pattern of abuse, mostly against women, including verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, including the use of extensive grooming tactics. There's only one survivor mentioned in the indictment, though, identified as victim 1, so we don't know for sure their real identity. But it's very possible that victim 1 is Cassandra Ventura, Diddy's ex, who you probably know as the singer Cassie. She's the first one that put pen to paper in terms of allegations against Diddy, filing a scathing lawsuit last November. Cassie laid out a series of accusations against Diddy, saying over the course of their relationship, he physically beat her, emotionally controlled her, and sexually assaulted her. She also alleges Diddy forced her to have sex with prostitutes and recorded it. Let's be real, I know you're multitasking when you're listening to this video, and if you're out running errands, listen up. I have to tell you about the free app Upside that gets you cash back on daily essentials. I use it every time I pump gas. It's easy and free, so why not? All you have to do is get the Upside app and then claim an offer for whatever you're buying. So you pay as usual and then just follow the steps on the app to get paid. To find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside, or scan the QR code on the screen and use our promo code LCNews to get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Cassie's lawsuit was settled just one day after it was filed, but it paved the way for multiple other accusers to come forward. Since last November, Diddy's been listed as a defendant in 11 civil suits. Like Cassie, producer Rodney Jones, known professionally as Lil Rod, also accused Diddy of sexual assault. He alleges Diddy drugged him and forced Lil Rod to have sex with a prostitute. On top of that, Lil Rod says his accusations can be corroborated with hundreds of hours of video and audio recordings, showing Diddy and his associates engaging in some serious illegal activity. The indictment also mentions recordings, saying that when the federal raids were executed on Diddy's homes back in March, investigators collected electronic evidence for their case. The indictment also notes investigators collected 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lube, which really puts into perspective the severity and scope of these so-called freak-offs. According to the indictment, these freak-offs were elaborate and produced sex performances that Combs arranged, directed, masturbated during, and often electronically recorded. During these sessions, Diddy would force victims to use drugs, have sex with prostitutes, and be recorded doing all this, sometimes without their knowledge. Again, all this was heard before Diddy's federal charges in multiple civil suits brought by survivors. But back to the indictment. Prosecutors allege Diddy completed these freak-offs with the help of his associates working for the Combs enterprise. Not only would these associates help suppress the victims, but they also arranged the freak-offs by booking hotel rooms and stocking these rooms with required freak-off necessities like baby oil or personal lubricant. These associates would also procure sex workers and IVs that were given to both Combs and the victims after these freak-off sessions to help them recover from the physical exertion and drug use. As part of all this, Diddy and his associates transported and caused to be transported commercial sex workers across state lines and internationally. One such sex worker, an unidentified male, says Diddy flew him from Atlanta to Miami for a freak-off just last year. The male escort's name has not been revealed publicly, but according to TMZ, he spoke with federal prosecutors in New York on September 25th. He reportedly signed a proffer agreement and then divulged key information to prosecutors about this freak-off. He says it happened in May 2023, and it involved himself, Diddy, and another woman. The escort says he had sex with the woman while Diddy watched and recorded. And apparently, the escort says he has a copy of this recording, and now so do federal prosecutors. Since news of these freak-offs broke, Diddy's attorney Mark Agnifilo has addressed these allegations, saying that they were just threesomes by consenting adults. But is that what the electronic evidence will show? And how vital is this sex tape for the prosecution? Here's where we bring in former federal prosecutor Nima Rahmani. I wanted to speak to you specifically today as a former federal prosecutor because there's some news in the way of the prosecution in this case. Apparently, a male escort has come forward to the prosecution in Diddy's case with a sex tape talking about these freak-offs. What do you think would have compelled him to come forward right now?
Well, the fact that Diddy is now in custody and won't be released pending trial may have motivated other people to come forward who may have been worried for their safety. And whenever there's a situation like this, it can be victims, it can be a Me Too effect, right? Where there's power in other individuals who have come forward, and it's essentially a domino effect. And U.S. Attorney Damian Williams, when he had that press conference, he actually put up a hotline for any individuals who participated in the freak-offs. And the reason why this type of evidence is so damaging for Diddy is you both have a witness and you have a video. And the video doesn't lie. And the irony is that Diddy took these videos apparently to have a leverage over the participants, but now those videos are going to be used against him in a very serious criminal trial.
Talking about the new information we have about this alleged freak off, the sex tape, and the male escort who actually spoke with federal prosecutors, he signed something called a proffer agreement. Can you explain what that is to me?
A proffer agreement means that an individual is going to come to the U.S. Attorney's Office, sit down with prosecutors, and have a conversation. And anything that the person who's proffering says can't be used against them. So it's a protection for the person who is proffering. Now, in this case, here's someone who's admitting to engaging in prostitution. So the lawyer for the commercial sex workers certainly wouldn't want the proffer to be prosecuted based on those admissions. Sometimes it's also called queen for a day. Essentially means that whatever you tell prosecutors can't be used against you in that session.
And prosecutors would agree to it because they believe the information that this man has is worth it to use in their case against Diddy.
It's routine because you want to encourage people to come forward without fear that their statements will be used against them. Obviously, the sex worker in this case is not the target of the investigation, not even the subject. I mean, he apparently is going to be a witness, so not someone the feds are going to go after. So they want to make sure that the witnesses know that, if they say something that is incriminating, that's not going to be the basis for a criminal prosecution. Now, if they find out information or evidence outside the proffer session, they can use that against the person who's cooperating, but nothing that's said in the proffer itself.
What are investigators really doing? Looking through this video, obviously they want to watch it and see what evidence they have, but what are they looking for?
Well, first you have to establish a chain of custody, right? That the video is accurate. How would the sex worker have it even, right? If these are videos that were taken by Diddy himself, how did you come to have possession of this video? Was it emailed to you? Was it airdropped to you? Did you take the video? So the authentication, the chain of custody, that's very important. And then, of course, they're going to analyze the video to see what's in there. Now, Diddy's lawyers have apparently responded to this video, and they've said that this is consistent with what Diddy said the whole time, that he would engage in these threesomes. It wasn't an orgy, but it would be a threesome with a male sex worker and a female companion, and Diddy would watch and he would masturbate, apparently. So it's also consistent with some of the things that Cassie Ventura said. Now, of course, Cassie said that it was forced and she was raped and she was compelled to do this, and that's what makes it trafficking. Diddy, of course, is saying that this is all consensual. But I think those are the steps. The first is just the foundation piece. And then really, what is the video showing? Does it support an argument that this is consensual? Or does it support that force, that coercion, which would make it trafficking.
Here's where things get really tricky because, as you said, Diddy is going to say, hey, this was consensual. They were into it, I was into it. But we've heard in 11 civil suits and now a federal indictment that it wasn't consensual. A lot of these survivors were forced to partake in these freak offs. So, how will each side go about proving it was consensual or it wasn't?
That's going to be the key question in the case. The case will come down entirely to consent or not. So the government has the burden, of course, they're going to have to show that this wasn't consensual. So obviously, if there's something that's said or done in the videos that shows force or coercion, that's game over for Diddy. If it doesn't, then the question is the victims are going to have to testify. And like you said, there's 8, 9, 10 victims now who filed civil lawsuits. How compelling is their testimony? I would argue, as a former prosecutor, that's very compelling because even if you don't believe one victim or two victims, because you buy the argument that they're trying to shake Diddy down and get money from Combs as part of these civil lawsuits, that this is all motivated by greed and it's fabricated, it's very hard to disbelieve the testimony of victim after victim that's telling essentially the same story. So there may be texts, there may be other communications as well that would come in. So that is the entire case as far as the U.S. Attorney's Office is concerned, showing that coercion, that force, because this isn't the type of case that they would have just brought just to prove the prostitution counts, because obviously prostitution is illegal, prostitution is consensual, but there's a commercial component, right? But that would be a huge loss for the government if they only prevailed on the prostitution counts and the jury bought that this was consensual, but it was just paid for.
A lot of people are talking about witness testimony and kind of speculating that Cassie could be a star witness for the prosecution. But we have Cassie's lawsuit and then 10 others, accusers who've come forward. So, kind of a significant number there. However, in the federal indictment, there's only one victim listed as victim one. Why may that be that the feds didn't include additional victims? And I guess another question in regards to that, would they be calling more than one of these survivors?
Sierra, I have to admit, I was surprised. We've been talking about this case for many, many, many months. And the raid of Diddy's homes 6 months ago, as Los Angeles and Miami homes, I expected a very broad, sprawling indictment, naming lots of people, lots of victims. And like you said, the indictment really only identifies one victim. It's clear that it's Cassie Ventura based on the description of that victim. So the question is, are they not sure about other victims? What's taking so long in terms of getting their ducks in order to move forward? Because certainly, although Cassie's by far and away the most important victim, given the length of her relationship with Combs, I would expect that the prosecution is going to want many more people to come testify. And why weren't those necessarily named in the indictment? That's a very good question.
What about this sex worker who's recently come forward just this week to talk about these freak offs? Do you think he could be called to testify too?
No question. Anyone who was a participant or a witness of the freak-offs absolutely may be called as a witness by either side. If the government believes that this is someone that's going to prove that the force, fraud, coercion, then they're going to be a government witness. And if Diddy's lawyers, and I'm sure they're going to have witnesses of their own, believe that the sex workers are going to come testify that this was paid but consensual, you better believe that that person is going to be on the defense's witness list. And I'm sure there's going to be some witnesses on both sides, because even though the vast majority of people have spoken out against Diddy and against this violence, there have been a small number of people who have come out to support him, to say that I never experienced this side of Combs.
But I'm wondering about the electronic evidence, these sex tapes of the freak offs. Obviously, they're very intimate. It's people having sex, potentially against their own will. Is this something that would be shown in court?
It would be shown in court. Now, obviously, this trial isn't televised, so it's not going to be on Law and Crime. But it would be shown in court. If it were televised, obviously those portions would not be televised. But absolutely, it could be something lewd, it could be something pornographic. It's still evidence, and it's still going to be shown to the jury. So There's no exception for evidence not coming in because of its lewd nature.
I guess that leads into my next question, as the prosecution is obviously interviewing some of these survivors in the case, talking about what happened to them. How are they going to prepare these witnesses for reliving this really traumatic event or events in their life, potentially even watching themselves on the screen be abused? How do you prepare for that?
The best way to prepare a witness, and it can be a victim or any type of witness, is actually put them through a mock cross-examination. We know that Diddy's lawyers are going to be very aggressive. They're going to argue that this is all fabricated, this is all made up. The sex happened, but it was all consensual. So they're going to go after these witnesses and call them liars. So oftentimes what will happen is you'll have one of the prosecutors, they'll play the role of the defense attorney, and they'll do a cross-examination just to prepare the witness for what they may expect when they actually testify live before a jury.
What about Diddy's side of things? Recently, we've heard from his attorney, Mark Agnifilo, who said, hey, Diddy wants to go on the stand. He wants to tell his own story. Do you think that's likely that P. Diddy himself would come up and talk on the stand?
Defense lawyers say all sorts of things, and I did hear that. I would be very surprised because talking about cross-examination, that cross-examination would be brutal. Diddy has a history of alleged violence. Some of it is pretty clear. The 2016 Cassie video, of course, was very graphic, very disturbing, and I think Diddy will get torn up on cross-examination. It's very risky to put a defendant on the stand. The entire case will usually come down to his or her testimony. I don't think the defense is going to do that. This may be gamesmanship. Some of this may be PR from his team trying to get out ahead of all the bad press. Just like the defense said that Diddy bought his 1,000 bottles of lube from Costco because he liked to buy in bulk. I would, take everything a criminal defense attorney in this case says with a grain of salt.
Circling back to this new information we have from this male escort, he says that it happened in May of 2023, so just a little over a year ago. And the indictment itself lists a pattern of alleged abuse, all at the hands of Diddy, dating back to 2009. Obviously, we know other lawsuits go way back to the 90s, but according to this federal indictment, 2009. And now we have something bringing us into 1 year ago. Is that helpful for the prosecution to show it was recent?
Sierra, it's very helpful because you don't want claims that are barred by the statute of limitations. So under RICO and most federal laws, there's a 5-year statute of limitations. Now, sex trafficking no longer has a statute, but it did earlier, and you can't make those changes retroactive. So that 5-year statute for RICO is important because you need one predicate act within the 5 years. Now, once you have that, you can go back another 10 years to get a second predicate act. So, the example I like to give is obviously it would be a state charge, but the statute of limitations for the 2016 beating of Cassie Ventura at the Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles, that's run. Prosecutors can't file charges on that unless they can show some sort of tolling or some reason why the statute should otherwise not have run because of a cover-up. But that's very difficult to prove. So what prosecutors are going to want to do is get as much conduct that is not barred by the statute into the indictment. Now, one important thing about RICO is predicate acts can be state crimes. They can also be crimes that are no longer within the statute of limitations. So that's one of the really powerful things about RICO. It brings a lot of charges. It brings a lot of evidence in that you might not necessarily be able to charge individually.
Do you think that before this case would head to trial, that prosecutors are going to get a couple more calls, maybe even some more video showing these freak-offs?
Absolutely. And even when I prosecute sexual assault, sexual harassment cases, oftentimes harassers, abusers, they're not abusing just one person. There's lots and lots of victims. So we'll file a civil lawsuit. And just like Cassie's case, even though it settled the very next day, was really a motivating factor for so many others to come forward because there is this psychology of an abuse victim. They don't want to relive that trauma. They certainly don't want to testify in a very public way at a trial that's going to get national and international attention. But as more people come forward, it does give those victims and those participants strength. So absolutely, yes, Sierra, I do expect others to come forward before trial.
Following Diddy's arrest last week, he pleaded not guilty, and his attorney Mark Agnifilo released a statement. It reads in part, quote, "Sean Diddy Combs is a music icon, self-made entrepreneur, loving family man and proven philanthropist who has spent the last 30 years building an empire, adoring his children and working to uplift the Black community. He is an imperfect person, but is not criminal. To his credit, Mr. Combs has been nothing but cooperative with this investigation, and he voluntarily relocated to New York last week in anticipation of these charges. Please reserve your judgment until you have all the facts. These are the acts of an innocent man with nothing to hide, and he looks forward to clearing his name in court. For now, Diddy is being held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. He's expected back in court on October 9th. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.